Rich, we've been touching on some deep topics here, but I have a more amusing question about your youth. So
Okay.
I know you got into karate early on,
Yes.
and I know very little about MMA, but I was also like you as a youth. I was into martial arts, so I was doing karate, kung fu, taekwondo, things like that. And I wanted to ask you because I also know Bloodsport had a huge impact on your childhood. So for those that don't know, Bloodsport is a movie by Jean-Claude Van Damme about a guy called Dukes, Frank Dukes. Apparently,
Mm.
it's based on a guy called Frank Dukes, who Rich later met, and you've never actually went into that much detail about meeting him. So I was curious about that. But first, I want to ask you something. So growing up in the 80s, 90s era, when MMA wasn't fully, and even when you competed, it wasn't fully like developed into what it is today.
Yep.
That we lived at a time in the early 90s and at least in the 80s where there were people doing like 1 inch punches, and you couldn't really know when you were a child, reading books about martial arts, what was effective in combat and what wasn't. So I was curious to know your experience in karate as a youth. I know later you did wrestling, and then I think in college you got into Brazilian jiu-jitsu, boxing, and Muay Thai properly.
Hmm.
But how did the karate influence your later fighting? Did it mislead you? Did it like not only was it not optimal, but did it mislead you in some ways? Because a lot of the katas are not very useful, and when we were taught back then, we were taught that this is like completely practical.
Well, I'll say this, right? Like, it's kind of like Bruce Lee's philosophy. You know, he's going to take what works and then he's going to get rid of what doesn't. So you can look at any system. Let's take boxing, for example. In the art of boxing, there are things for mixed martial arts that will work, and there are things for mixed martial arts that will not work. When I started initially working with a boxing coach, my boxing coach had me throwing like lead hooks that would leave my entire front side exposed, like turning the hips, over committing to a punch as it applies to mixed martial arts. These kinds of things leave you open for shots and stuff like that. So as I was working with my boxing coach, there was a lot of technique that we had to kind of, manipulate or whatever in order to fit so that it would fit for mixed martial arts, as well as like when you're throwing punches, to be able to set up shots off of punches is much different than say a boxer would. We talked about that shoulder at the beginning and that kind of lean back style, like something like a Floyd Mayweather's type of style of boxing where you can lean back and do all that movement. These things are great until somebody suddenly throw cut kicks at your head and you're going to get kicked in the face. So when I'm working with a boxing coach, for example, I have to eliminate all these aspects of boxing that don't work well for me. Now, as this applies to my original training in karate, much is the same. If I'm going to take that Bruce Lee mentality, I got to use what works and I got to get rid of what doesn't work. Just to give you an example, I think one of the things that karate did for me, because I did an Okinawan style Shornryu, Matsubayashi Ryu karate, and just side story on that. Recently, I did a seminar for. I'm helping this young man walk across the country who had cancer and was told he would never walk again. And so I did this seminar here outside of Cincinnati with myself, Matt Brown, Matt Hamill, and Mark Coleman. Really cool. It was just to raise money for this cause. And my karate instructor from high school actually came and took my seminar. And I thought, wow, it's kind of cool how life just circles back around. But anyway, like when I was training karate, for example, one of the things that karate really helped me with was when I'm moving, like as you're moving and you're throwing those traditional punches, which you can't see me doing here unless those traditional, punches, right? As I was learning that, like you walk and you step as you're punching. Well, you never walk, for example, in boxing. But what that concept taught me was a lot of power and hip movement. So I had the ability, for example, I'm naturally a right-handed guy predominantly. I do some things left-handed and I fight left-handed. And I fight left-handed because karate taught me how to lock in my hip on those punches and move with the shoulder, the hip, those whole body mechanics very, very well. And when I started doing boxing, like when I started doing mixed martial arts, I was at times when I was doing my striking, like I would flow back and forth, or at least try to, between my stances. And what I realized was that I move way better as a southpaw than I do as a conventional person. And even though my right hand is probably technically stronger, at least, if I want to throw a ball or something like that, I realized like I can probably teach my left hand how to hit hard enough that I can take advantage of being able to move really well. So karate taught me a lot of these concepts, like the overall system, the katas and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, not very useful for fighting, but there were a lot of like small details and concepts that really transitioned over. Along those lines, also, I worked out in a martial arts school that was like it was like our karate school was hardcore. Like It was a hard training sessions. I mean, hard training sessions. Like we'd sit there and stand in these hourglass stances for like, hours, like building up our legs and stuff like that. And it would just,
Is that the horse stance they call it?
Yeah,
And Kung Fu? I hated that.
Yeah, all that.
Well, so sometimes I sit with my wife. Well, obviously, I don't know much about fighting, right? But I did all that stuff as a kid. So sometimes my wife and we watch the UFC fights, and I tell her, I used to sit for like an hour in this horse stance in the Shaolin Kung Fu. I don't know what it would do for me in a fight now. I have no idea. So, but you didn't mind that stuff, huh?
If nothing else, it's mental dexterity. Like I had the ability, I would go in and I can remember working katas, and I would come in and I would do like the first move of the kata, and I would do this move 500 times type of thing, like just over and over. I'd be the last guy on the mat, or it was a deck. It was an actual wooden deck, but I'd be the last guy in the school, and I'd be doing these moves and spending hours doing this stuff. And if nothing else, it taught me mental dexterity that would pay off later when I was doing jujitsu and boxing and things like that, because I had that work ethic instilled in me. So it gave me a lot of that. That's the foundation that I needed, that when I transitioned into other martial arts, like jujitsu, like wrestling, like boxing and kickboxing and stuff like that, that I had these, if it wasn't the mental fortitude to be able to start back over. Because think about this, man, and I've experienced this many times. I was a black belt in karate. I was like my sensei's number one student, right? Like I was the Johnny Lawrence of Cobra Kai, in essence. and then suddenly I'm going to go to this jujitsu school where I'm just getting mopped up on them. Like they're basically taking me and doing this on the mat. Like, yeah. And so I had to start back over. And then even when I started fighting and climbing the ranks, and I had become somewhat of an accomplished fighter, maybe hadn't made it to the UFC yet or anything like that, but had garnered some recognition within the ranks of people who knew as I was coming up. I had to start wrestling, because I didn't wrestle in high school, being from Ohio. And a lot of people think that I wrestled. Oh. I never wrestled. And so I literally had to pay for it, like literally pay money to learn all the wrestling that I could have learned in high school. And I had to start back over again where after I was a fairly accomplished jiu-jitsu player, but I could play off my back real well, but I didn't understand the game of wrestling. So now suddenly I'm like, well, okay, now I'm pretty good at fighting, right? Like I got these, I'm doing boxing. I got this jiu-jitsu. I have this background in karate. I'm going to this wrestling school, and now I'm getting mopped up on the mats again. And I had to start all back over. And I wholeheartedly believe that my beginnings in karate, in that traditional karate I did, gave me the mental fortitude to be able to keep starting back over to do those things.
Rich, can I just jump in and ask a question? When you started, mixed martial arts was very polarized and it was very independent. You had your karate guy, you had your boxers, you had your Muay Thai fighters, you had your gi jiu-jitsu guys, even back in those early days, right? No gi was not quite a thing. And so you had these segmented sports, and inside those segmented sports, there was the concept of, this is our style. You train in our gym with our athletes. You don't go to the similar gym across the street, across town. You don't train with those guys. You don't share our technique with them. Did you have, because you floated not just from different gyms to completely different arts, did you have any pushback from your coach, from your teammates? Did you find it hard in order to get that additional cross training, as now we now know? And you were one of the first cross-trained athletes, I say truly trained cross-trained athletes, guys like you, guys like George St. Pierre. You changed the sport, from my opinion, standing outside, doing what I do. You certainly set the template that I think most athletes follow now, and it was rather brave in kicking off. But did you have pushback, especially back in those early days where now it's not a big deal? You have cross-trained MMA gyms, anyone comes in. But what was your experience like coming through that?
Well, okay. So first of all, you talk about doing things differently and being kind of on that cutting edge. I mean, as the saying goes, if you do the same things that other people do, you're going to get the same results that they get, right? And so you have to constantly be thinking outside of the box. Keep in mind that my generation of athletes really was that first generation of true mixed martial artists, if you want to call them that, right? I mean, maybe you had Ken Shamrock early on, who was a shoot fighter or something like that. But most of the athletes in the UFC at that point in time were stylistically one or the other. Now, I'll say this: when you talk about the polarization or whatever, as I trained, my training was, I would go to a separate boxing coach. I had a kickboxing coach. I had a wrestling coach. I had my jiu-jitsu coach. And then I had a strength and conditioning coach at a different gym. So I was going to all these different facilities all the time. Yep. And I had to travel all over the city in order to get to these places. So I never had any pushback in between any of these guys. Well, other than, look, anytime you run a camp, you're going to, like, there's always drama in a camp, and some people get along at times and other times they don't and whatever. And you have those kinds of things, but there was never any kind of issues with people necessarily stepping on each other's toes, because I went to the power station here in Cincinnati. Mike was my strength and conditioning coach, and everybody knew that Mike ran the show with my strength and conditioning. There's the show when they did the All Access on me with Rochelle Leah years ago. People saw that workout that you're probably referring to, Mike. That we did in the gym, where we just did this circuit, and we took that, and that was like our infancy stages of this whole cross training that we did. And as time went on, things became, I'll use the word functional, because we think of like things like tire flipping as functional, when we can get into what the definition of functional is, because tire flipping makes you good at tire flipping. Like we in this modern world, we suddenly became like, well, actual deadlifting with a bar is not functional, but tire flipping is. Which is just like,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Don't get me started on this whole functionality thing. But either way, like the workouts had more of those functional, I keep using the quote marks here for anybody that's just listening to audio on this, exercises in it. And we really did construct those, and I can get into what we did with these kinds of things to mimic what a fight would really look like. But his role was that, and it was clearly defined. And George's role was the BJJ, and Neil Rowe was my kickboxing coach, and Rob Radford was my boxing coach. And then I worked with some wrestlers, like at a local college here at Mount St. Joe. I began working with a guy named Ryan Root at some point in time. I had a couple different wrestling coaches that I worked with, but it wasn't until midway through my career, Mike, that I started working with Matt Hume up in Seattle. Him and Joel Jamieson up there did my strength and conditioning. And that's the first time where I ever worked in a facility that was kind of all inclusive. But of course, the resources like that, like the people that have that kind of knowledge of MMA just really didn't exist. So I'll say this, as it applies to training, like you can, I believe that in this modern landscape, people talk about the evolution of something and how things have gotten better. I actually think that this modern landscape of mixed martial arts schools, where everybody comes in and does everything, on one hand can be very, very beneficial to the quality of athlete, but on the other hand can be quite detrimental to the quality of the athlete, because I believe that there is value in going into a boxing school and working just pure boxing. I believe that there is value in going into a jiu-jitsu school and working just pure, BJJ. And so there are times in my career where it's like, okay, I'm going to go and do this BJJ class, and then now I'm going to go and do this mixed martial arts session. I'm going to go and do this boxing class. Now I'm going to go do my strength and conditioning. Oh, now I'm going to go to this other mixed martial arts session. So my group, or my team at that time, was kind of this combination of old school separated arts and the new school mixed martial arts. So we dedicated time to the separate arts and time to putting it all together. And I, to this day, if I was a modern day athlete, I believe that I would still train that way. I wouldn't go to a school that was just only MMA.